In April of 1983, a man stepped off a military transport plane onto French soil for the first time in nearly 40 years. He was 70 years old, silver-haired, slightly stooped, the kind of grandfather who might feed pigeons in a park. Cameras strained to catch his face, and when he finally looked into them, he smiled. He was not afraid. He had spent the previous 38 years believing correctly that the most powerful government on earth would protect him. The men who tortured children in a school outside Lyon do not usually die in comfortable beds. This one nearly did. The reason he almost got away with it is not a story about a fugitive who ran fast and hid well. It is a story about the people who chose to hire him, pay him, and smuggle him across an ocean, knowing exactly what he had done. His name was Klaus Barbie, and before he became a paid asset of American intelligence, he was known across occupied France by a single word that people were afraid to say out loud: the Butcher. He earned it in Lyon, a city he ruled through a mixture of bribery, terror, and a personal appetite for pain that unsettled even the men who worked alongside him. To understand how a country that had just spent years and hundreds of thousands of lives destroying the Nazi regime could turn around and put one of its cruelest servants on the payroll, you have to start not with the crimes, but with the strange calculus of the years right after the war, when yesterday's enemy became tomorrow's tool, and almost no one in a position of power seemed to mind.
Klaus Barbie was born in 1913 in a small town near the French border, the son of a school teacher whose drinking purtled into violence as the years went on. The household was not a warm one. His father had been wounded and captured during the First World War, and he came home carrying a bitterness toward France that he poured into his sons at the dinner table. When Barbie was a teenager, both his younger brother and his father died in a short span. The path he might have taken, university, perhaps the clergy, closed behind him. What opened instead was a country sliding towards something new and loud and full of promise for angry young men with no prospects. He joined the Nazi Party in 1935 and volunteered for the SS Security Service, the SD, not long after. He was 22, and for the first time in his life, he had found an organization that valued exactly the qualities his upbringing had ground into him. He rose quickly because he was good at the work. The work was surveillance, interrogation, the patient assembly of files on people who did not yet know they were being watched. Barbie had a gift for it. He could be charming when charm served him, menacing when it did not, and he possessed an instinct for the pressure point in any human being sitting across from him. By the time Germany occupied France, he had been noticed by superiors who understood that this kind of talent was rare. In November of 1942, he was posted to Lyon and given command of the local Gestapo. He was 29 years old, and he was about to become the most feared man in the region.
Lyon was not chosen by accident. It sat in the heart of France's resistance movement, a maze of old streets and hidden passageways called traboules that ran through and between buildings, perfect for people who needed to disappear. The city was thick with underground networks moving weapons, information, and refugees. Barbie's job was to break them, and he approached it with a thoroughness that went beyond duty. He set up his headquarters first at a hotel, later at another building whose basement rooms became notorious. What happened in those rooms has been described by the few who survived them, and their accounts share a common thread. Barbie did not delegate the cruelty. He liked to be present. He liked, by many accounts, to do it himself. He used electric shock.
He used beatings that broke bones and burst organs. He submerged prisoners in freezing water until they lost consciousness, revived them, and did it again. Survivors spoke of him keeping pets in the room, a dog he would command to attack, and of a strange, almost cheerful demeanor he maintained throughout, as though the screaming were a kind of music he enjoyed. One woman recalled him pausing in the middle of torturing her to eat. The detail that recurs in testimony after testimony is not the violence alone, but the pleasure, the sense that for Barbie this was not merely a means to extract information, it was something he wanted.
The information he extracted was real, and it cost lives on a scale that Lyon is still counting. His greatest single triumph in the eyes of his superiors came in June of 1943, when he captured Jean Moulin. Moulin was not an ordinary prisoner. He was the man Charles de Gaulle had personally chosen to unify the fractured French resistance under a single command, the closest thing the underground had to a central nervous system. His capture was a catastrophe for the resistance and a career-defining coup for Barbie. What followed were days of torture so severe that Moulin never spoke, never gave up a single name, and died from his injuries while being transported toward Germany. He became a martyr, a national symbol whose ashes were eventually placed in the Pantheon in Paris alongside the greatest figures in French history. And the man who beat him to death would spend the next 40 years being shielded by governments that found him useful. Barbie's crimes in Lyon were not confined to the resistance. In April of 1944, he ordered a raid on a children's home in the village of Izieu, a refuge where Jewish children had been hidden by people who hoped the war would end before anyone found them. 44 children were there that morning, the youngest barely 4 years old. Barbie had them loaded onto trucks. He signed the telex reporting the operation himself, a document that would survive the war and hang over him decades later like a noose he had knotted with his own hands. The children were sent east. Nearly all of them were murdered at Auschwitz. There was no military logic to Izieu, no resistance cell to break, no information to gain. There were only children, and a man who sent them to their deaths and then went to lunch. By the time Allied forces were closing in on Lyon in 1944, Barbie had sent thousands to concentration camps and killed or ordered the killing of thousands more. He fled as the city fell, melting into the chaos of a collapsing Reich. And here the story might have ended, the way it ended for many mid-level Nazi officers, in a prison cell or at the end of a rope after Nuremberg, or in an anonymous grave in the rubble of a defeated country. It did not end that way for Klaus Barbie. It did not end that way because within 2 years of the war's conclusion, the United States Army came looking for men exactly like him, and it liked what it found. The world after 1945 was not the clean moral landscape that later generations imagine. The alliance that had crushed Germany was disintegrating almost before the ink on the surrender was dry. The Soviet Union, so recently a partner, was hardening into an adversary, and the Western powers found themselves suddenly desperate for something they had spent the war destroying: German expertise, German networks, German men who understood how to gather intelligence and hunt down communists. The Cold War did not begin with a declaration. It began with a scramble. And in that scramble, the Americans, running counterintelligence in occupied Germany, made a decision that would haunt their successors for decades.
They decided that some Nazis were too useful to punish.
The internal justifications for this are preserved in the record, and they make for uncomfortable reading. Barbie's handlers argued that turning him over to the French would expose American intelligence methods, would reveal the identities of other agents, would compromise operations. There was also, unmistakably, a reluctance to admit what they had done. To hand Barbie to France was to confess that the United States had knowingly employed a war criminal, a man wanted for the torture and murder of the very allies America claimed to have fought for. So they did not hand him over. Instead, when French pressure became too intense to ignore, they arranged for him to disappear a second time, and this disappearance would take him across an ocean. The mechanism was a network that has since become infamous, a series of escape routes known as the Ratlines. These were channels, some running through the Vatican, some through sympathetic officials in various countries, that funneled wanted Nazis out of Europe and into new lives in South America and elsewhere. American intelligence used one of these routes to spirit Barbie out of Germany. In 1951, provided with false documents identifying him as a man named Klaus Altmann, Barbie boarded a ship with his wife and children and sailed for Argentina, and from there to Bolivia. The United States government had taken a man wanted for crimes against humanity, given him a new name, and helped him vanish onto another continent rather than face the consequences of having employed him.
In Bolivia, Klaus Altmann built a comfortable life. He went into business, worked in shipping and sawmills, and made himself useful to a series of Bolivian governments, several of them brutal military dictatorships that valued precisely the skills he had honed under the Nazis and refined for the Americans. He advised on internal security. He helped organize repression. There are credible accounts linking him to the darkest operations of the region's military regimes, including the machinery of torture and disappearance that those governments used against their own citizens. The Butcher of Lyon had found, in the cold logic of Cold War Latin America, a place where his particular talents were not a liability, but a resume. He even, by some accounts, played a role in the hunt for Che Guevara. He lived openly. He was not hiding under a rock. He was a respected businessman in La Paz, and the people who knew his real name knew better to say it. He might have died there, an old man in the Andes, if not for two people who refused to let the past stay buried. Beate and Serge Klarsfeld were Nazi hunters, a German-born woman and her French husband, a survivor's son, who had dedicated their lives to tracking down the men who had escaped justice. In the early 1970s, they began to piece together that the businessman Klaus Altmann in Bolivia was in fact Klaus Barbie. They gathered evidence. They compared photographs, traced documents, built a case that became impossible to dismiss. Beate Klarsfeld traveled to Bolivia and confronted the situation directly, chaining herself in protest, forcing the world's cameras onto a man who had spent decades counting on the world's forgetting. The Bolivian government, still protecting him, refused to extradite. But the wall of anonymity that had shielded Barbie for 20 years had finally cracked.
For another decade, Bolivia held firm, and Barbie remained beyond France's reach, sheltered by governments that owed him or feared what he knew. Then, in 1982, Bolivia's politics shifted. A new democratic government came to power, one with no stake in protecting an aging German war criminal and every reason to improve relations with France.
Negotiations followed, quiet and complicated, and in early 1983, the decision was made. Barbie was arrested, ostensibly over an unpaid debt, and then expelled from the country. He was flown out, and the plane carried him not to freedom, but to France, to the nation whose sons and daughters he had tortured, to the city where his name still made people flinch. Nearly 40 years after he fled Lyon, Klaus Barbie was coming back to face it. The trial that followed in 1987 was not merely a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning that France had postponed for 2 generations. Barbie was charged with crimes against humanity, a category distinct from ordinary war crimes, precisely because it could not be excused, could not be defended as the grim necessity of combat. The prosecution was built on the things he had done that had no military justification at all: the deportation of the Jews, the children of Izieu above all. Survivors took the stand, people who had been tortured in his basement, who had watched loved ones vanish onto eastbound trains, faced him in a courtroom and told the world what he was. Barbie, for much of the trial, refused even to be present, dismissing the proceedings, unrepentant to the end.
His defense was handled by a lawyer named Jacques Vergès, a man who specialized in turning trials into indictments of the accusers. Vergès did not seriously contest that Barbie had done these things. Instead, he tried to put France and the West on trial, arguing that the crimes of colonialism and the atrocities committed by France in Algeria and elsewhere were no different in kind from what Barbie stood accused of. It was a strategy designed to muddy the moral water, to suggest that the men judging Barbie had no right to judge anyone. It did not work in the way Vergès hoped, but it raised a question that lingered in the courtroom and lingers still. If the crimes against humanity were so clear, why had the United States hired the man who committed them? Why had it protected him? Why had it helped him escape? That question forced an answer because by the time of the trial, the story of Barbie's American employment could no longer be denied. In 1983, the United States government commissioned an official investigation into how a wanted war criminal had come to work for American intelligence and be smuggled to safety. The report that resulted confirmed what had long been suspected. American agents had knowingly employed Klaus Barbie. They had obstructed French efforts to bring him to justice. They had used the Ratlines to move him out of reach. The United States formally apologized to France, an extraordinary admission that one of the war's supposed moral victors had shielded one of its worst criminals because he was, for a time, convenient. The apology could not undo the decades of freedom Barbie had enjoyed, the life he had built, the additional horrors he may have helped inflict in South America. But it was at least an acknowledgement that the convenience had a cost, and that the cost had been paid by his victims twice over, once when he tortured them, and again when the country that claimed to fight for them let him walk free.
Klaus Barbie was convicted on all counts in July of 1987 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was 73 years old. He served 4 years, showing no remorse in any of them, and died of cancer in a prison hospital in Lyon in 1991, in the very city where he had earned his name. He died a convicted criminal, which is more than seemed likely for most of his life, and considerably more than his victims received. The children of Izieu got no trial, no old age, no death in a hospital bed. They got a truck, a train, and a gas chamber, at the order of a man who would go on to draw an American salary. What remains after the trial and the death and the apology is the harder thing to sit with. Klaus Barbie was a monster, and monsters, in the stories we tell ourselves, are supposed to be hunted down by the good. But Barbie was not hunted by the good. For crucial years, he was hired by them, hidden by them, and helped to escape by them, not because they misunderstood who he was, but because they understood exactly who he was and decided it did not matter. The Cold War made his cruelty a credential. His knowledge of interrogation, of surveillance, of how to break a human being, was the very thing that made him valuable to the people who should have put him on trial. The lesson of Klaus Barbie is not simply that evil men sometimes escape. It is that they escape because other men, men who consider themselves decent, calculate that evil is useful and act on the calculation. He was the Butcher of Lyon, and for a time he was ours.